Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving straight into an incredibly complex, high-stakes topic, the realities of India-Pakistan relations. Believe it or not, we are now exactly 1 year out from that dramatic military standoff back in May of 2025. And to really get a grip on what's happening beneath the surface today, we're going to be unpacking some precise insights from security analyst Muhammad Amir Rana.
To make sense of it all, we're going to break this down into 6 parts. We'll start with a fragile anniversary, move into the public deadlock, look at how quiet diplomacy survives, discuss the terrorism narrative, unpack the geopolitical recalibration, and finally wrap up with some seeds of hope.
All right, part 1, a fragile anniversary, the stalled promise of May 2025.
Let's rewind just a bit to May 2025. We all remember that highly dangerous military standoff between these two nuclear-armed neighbors, right? It was incredibly tense. Then, on May 10th, a U.S.-brokered ceasefire was abruptly announced. Shortly after that, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio promised broad talks would be held at a neutral site to sort things out. But here we are in May 2026. Those promised talks? Completely elusive. Instead of sitting at a table, we're seeing a constant verbal war where both sides are just projecting defense superiority.
It's actually kind of ironic when you think about it. When that ceasefire was first announced, U.S. President Donald Trump publicly congratulated both countries, praising them for showing, quote, common sense and great intelligence. Yet, despite that high praise, those structured talks just evaporated. Why? Well, according to the analysis, it's largely because the international actors who actually facilitated the ceasefire, the U.S. included, just lost interest. They didn't put the work into turning immediate crisis management into a structured, long-term peace process.
Moving right along to Section 2, the public deadlock, mistrust and political posturing. The source analysis objectively breaks down a really stark contrast in how both nations publicly view the situation. On one hand, India's reported stance points to the politicization of historical animosity, essentially using it for electoral gains. It views Pakistan as a core threat in its defense doctrine, and there are even reports of weaponizing leverages like water resources. On the flip side, Pakistan's reported stance reveals this deep, fundamental apprehension. They are highly concerned that India is actively exploiting internal conflicts, specifically in regions like Balochistan and along the Afghan border, to completely destabilize the country. And you've absolutely got to factor in the media landscape here. The author highlights how media environments on both sides essentially sell hatred, which traps leaders. They become sort of slaves to their own aggressive rhetoric. But here is a really critical takeaway from the source. Right now, Pakistan's civil and military leadership are actually aligned on remaining open to dialogue. In fact, no mainstream political party there openly opposes talking to India. The author also notes that their media is currently somewhat less toxic than the round-the-clock hostility broadcasted in India.
So, if everything is so hopelessly gridlocked in the public sphere, what on earth is happening behind closed doors? Let's get into Section 3. Quiet diplomacy survives. The hidden lifelines. To really grasp how these two nations keep from tipping over the edge, we have to talk about Track 1.5 and Track 2 diplomacy. What are these? Well, they're basically unofficial, highly discreet dialogues. You've got strategists, parliamentarians, former diplomats, and security representatives all sitting down together. The absolute key here is that they operate under strict political cover, meaning absolutely zero public readouts. Nobody tweets about these meetings. And get this number, 4. Despite the absolute public deep freeze and all that verbal warfare we just talked about, there were at least 4 of these super confidential Track 1.5 and Track 2 meetings held at undisclosed locations between 2025 and February of 2026. It proves that a pulse, a real line of communication, absolutely still exists. It just lives entirely in the shadows.
Alongside those secret meetings, there are a couple of other lifelines keeping things from boiling over. First, you have the DGMO hotline. That's the Directors General of Military Operations. This military hotline has actually been active since 1971, and it was used very effectively during the recent crisis to rapidly de-escalate tensions. Then, you've got the much more subtle tool of sports diplomacy. For example, recent decisions allowed Pakistani sportsmen to participate in international events on Indian soil. It sounds small, but it provides a tiny yet incredibly vital glimmer of interaction.
That brings us to Section 4, the terrorism narrative, a shift in focus. If you look at how these countries historically dealt with each other, there's been a monumental shift. For decades, the primary diplomatic framework was what they called the composite dialogue framework. This meant they sat down and focused on a broad range of multiple core issues. It was a big picture approach. But today, that whole framework has been completely scrapped. It's been replaced by a single issue confrontation. Literally everything else has been pushed to the back burner, replaced entirely by mutual accusations of terrorism. But here is where the source notes something truly fascinating. Perhaps for the very first time in decades, Pakistan is actually openly and directly engaging India specifically on this issue of terrorism. They're actively seeking mutual acknowledgement and reciprocity from New Delhi regarding their own internal security crises. It's a major change in diplomatic posture. So, why is Pakistan feeling positioned to do this right now? Well, let's look at Section 5, Geopolitical Recalibration, Shifting Global Balances. According to the analysis, Pakistan's strategic playbook has gone through a huge shift over the last year. First off, they have abandoned or suspended support for groups that were historically alleged to be proxies. Second, and this is a pretty wild diplomatic twist, they now have a severely strained relationship with the Afghan Taliban in Kabul, which is a group that India is now surprisingly engaging with. And third, Pakistan has racked up some major domestic successes fighting the Islamic State Khorasan, or ISK. So what's the so what here? Why does all this matter? Well, because these real domestic counterterrorism wins have actually allowed Pakistan to drastically improve its international standing. They've regained crucial diplomatic space, effectively neutralizing the terrorism stigma that India previously used to try and isolate Islamabad globally. Ultimately, this created a much more balanced international environment during the May standoff.
Which leaves us with our final part. Section 6, Seeds of Hope, the Path Forward.
So where on earth do these nuclear-armed neighbors go from here? The author does argue for maintaining optimism, but outlines a pretty tough reality. The space for broad-based official peace processes has drastically shrunk. And let's be honest, well-meaning public civil society efforts, like the ones hosted in Zoom chat rooms, unfortunately failed to make any real impact. But, and this is a big but, limited informal diplomatic contacts remain alive. These weak but surviving channels are the absolute non-negotiable starting point for any future peace.
This brings us to a massive, critical question for you to ponder today. If public diplomacy is essentially dead in the water and the public space for peace is constantly shrinking, can these quiet, informal networks provide the spark needed for a diplomatic miracle? It's an incredibly fragile pursuit, but a totally necessary one if we're going to prevent the next crisis. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll catch you on the next one.